Hey guys, welcome to the Liberal Hive Mind, a channel solely focused on exposing the abundant hypocrisy of the left. Oh man, woke ideology, woke talking points are just getting decimated in the most epic of fashion these days. Oh, poor CNN's Don Lemon. His days are probably numbered at the network. He's already lost his TV show, or his late night prime time show. They're putting him in the morning. And you know, probably what he was wishing during the last days of his prime time era was to go out avoiding any embarrassment. Well, not exactly, as Don Lemon gets totally and utterly embarrassed on his primetime show just the other night, challenging his British guest on the issue of royal wealth, immediately tries to shame the family's royal wealth, and takes the conversation to the issue of reparations, where he immediately gets completely and utterly embarrassed. Let me show you guys exactly what happened here, and let's discuss this idea of reparations and some of the talking points that we're seeing from the radical left. We've got some stuff to get into, so let's roll the tape. Alright folks, so let's first start off with the context. Let's take a look at this clip involving Don Lemon and his British guest.
Well, this is coming when, you know, there's all of this wealth, and you hear about it comes as England is facing rising costs of living, a living crisis, austerity budget cuts, and so on. And then you have those who are asking for reparations for colonialism, and they're wondering, you know, $100 billion, $24 billion here and there, 500 million there. Some people want to be paid back, and members of the public are wondering, why are we suffering when you are, you know, you have all of this vast wealth? Those are legitimate concerns.
Well, I think you're right about reparations in terms of if people want it, though, what they need to do is you always need to go back to the beginning of a supply chain. Where was the beginning of the supply chain? That was in Africa, and when across the entire world, when the slavery was taking place, which was the first nation in the world that abolished slavery? The first nation in the world to abolish it. It was started by William Wilberforce, was the British. In Great Britain, they abolished slavery. 2,000 naval men died on the high seas trying to stop slavery. Why? Because the African kings were rounding up their own people. They had them on cages waiting in the beaches. No one was running into Africa to get them. And I think you're totally right. If reparations need to be paid, we need to go right back to the beginning of that supply chain and say, who was rounding up their own people and having them handcuffed in cages? Absolutely. That's where they should start. And maybe, I don't know, the descendants of those families where they died in the high seas trying to stop the slavery, that those families should receive something too, I think, at the same time.
It's an interesting discussion, Hillary. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. We'll continue to discuss in the future. So remember the impact of the supply chain crisis on the economy during...
You see what I mean when I said in the intro that woke talking points are getting completely decimated these days? It's funny how you're turning on CNN and HBO and you're listening to talking points that we've been saying for a really long time. 2 or 3 days ago, Bill Maher went on a rant in his monologue covering basically the same issue.
Everybody who could afford one had a slave, including people of color. The way people talk about slavery these days, you'd think it was a uniquely American thing that we invented in 1619. But slavery throughout history has been the rule, not the exception. The Sumerians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, Romans, the Arabs, British, the early Americans, all the way up through R. Kelly. The Holy Bible is practically an owner's manual for slaveholders. The word slave comes from Slav, because so many Slavic people were enslaved, and they're as white as the Hallmark Channel. Who do you think gathered the slaves from the interior of Africa to sell to slave traders? Africans, who also kept their own slaves. We're a species prone to making others of our species our...
It's all just too convenient. In the call for reparations and the call for social justice, the only bad guys and the only people who owe anything are always white people and white nations. When it comes to the evils of slavery, the United States of America and the UK are at the core of the issue, people tell you, or leftoids tell you. They're the ones who should pay reparations. But when I think about the history, I think what an utterly ridiculous claim. You know, reparations were already paid. Maybe not in a dollar amount, in a direct reparations reparations payment, but it was paid for in blood. The United Kingdom was the first superpower at the time to not only abolish slavery, but to fight and sacrifice their own lives, to shed their own blood to stop the slave trade. In fact, back in the 1800s, the UK Parliament spent 20 million British pounds, which is equivalent to, I believe, $300 or $30 billion today. Let me double check and get the actual number. Well, I was way off. Here's the real number. The British government also paid 20 million pounds, the equivalent of 17 billion pounds today, to compensate slave owners for the lost capital associated with freeing slaves. This payout was a massive 40% of the government's budget and required many bonds to slave owners to effectuate the law. And of course, the leftoids, completely misunderstanding history and just being ridiculous in general, are outraged by this. They claim how despicable. The British government paid slave-owning families instead of paying reparations. Well, did they really have a choice? The fact of the matter is, they put their money where their mouth was and used nearly 50% of their annual budget to pay off slave owners to free slaves. They essentially ended the slave trade by paying off those slave-owning families. That's commendable. That's not an outrage. It was probably the only diplomatic solution at the time. It was either that or bloodshed, and they were willing to put their money where their mouth is. Not to mention, they also fought to end the slave trade, and in many cases fighting against African nations and African warlords to end the practice entirely. You're talking about two nations, the United States and the United Kingdom, that stood up for actual social justice and actual progress, that stood up for human rights. And I find it so disgraceful to demand more. What more can be done? You have two nations that were built off freedom and individual rights, two nations that over the last however many decades have had extremely generous welfare programs and enabled their citizens, regardless of color, regardless of race, regardless of anything, to feed their families and have access to every single opportunity. And while you have nations across the globe that are still committing human rights atrocities and still benefiting from slavery, we're sitting here and supposed to join the left in condemning and attacking these great nations. We're supposed to take this call for reparations from the monarchy seriously. And look, I'm not a fan of the monarchy. I think the whole royal family concept, having a king and a queen in a Western democracy, is a laughable idea. I'm no great British royal family or British monarchy fan or shill or stan, whatever you want to call me, but this discussion is ridiculous. And the idea that Queen Elizabeth is this great doer of evil and should be attacked and is actively being attacked by left-wingers on Twitter and left-wingers in the media, again, is completely and utterly ridiculous. Queen Elizabeth has a history of decolonization. That is her legacy, that is her history. Acceleration of decolonization. The 1960s and 1970s saw an acceleration in the decolonization of Africa and the Caribbean. More than 20 countries gained independence from Britain as a part of a planned transition to self-governance. In 1965, however, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Smith, in opposition to moves towards majority rule, unilaterally declared independence while expressing loyalty and devotion to Elizabeth, declaring her Queen of Rhodesia. Although Elizabeth formally dismissed him, the international community applied sanctions against Rhodesia. His regime survived for over a decade. As Britain's ties to its former empire weakened, the British government sought entry to the European community, a goal it achieved in 1973. It goes on, but the history of Queen Elizabeth is almost like the contraction or the retraction of the British Empire. The Western world has accelerated human rights and opportunity for everyone. It's paid for reparations in civil war and bloodshed. Countless lives were lost in the Civil War in the United States, fighting to abolish slavery. We've seen over a century of civil rights advancements, creating the most free places on earth to live. The greatest reparations that you could receive is literally being born in the Western world and having access to the freedom to make your own life and to earn your own living and to send your kids to school and to just live a good life in a great country. Not to mention all the various welfare programs and social security nests. And now we're going to pretend that these countries should, print more trillions upon trillions of dollars to give people more stimulus checks based on their race? How would you even implement such a thing? How would you even make it so that you're targeting the right people? People who are actually descendants or affected by the evils of the past. And if you just hand out more stimulus checks as reparations, all you're going to do is create another inflation crisis or worsen the current inflation crisis and end up making those people poorer than they were in the first place. It's just not how the world works. And it's also completely selective, that only communities that were affected by slavery deserve reparations. Completely ignores the entirety of human history. As I've mentioned a million times, I'm Greek. Do I deserve reparations from the Turkish? Of course not. And you know what? I don't want them and I don't need them. I don't need Cenk Uygur and Hassan Piker to hand me a check. I'm doing fine on my own. Every single nation on earth, every group of people has been marginalized or oppressed at some point in human history. And the idea that we have to actively spend taxpayer dollars to just hand out free money to anybody whose family history or lineage has some sort of connection to any event of historical oppression is unsustainable, and it's frankly just dumb. It's bad policy, and you know what it really is? It's entitlement. You don't need reparations, you need economic opportunity. You don't need big government socialism handouts. You need jobs, you need industry and service. And this mentality of the world owes me something, this government owes me something, this nation owes me something, never leads to anything good. And I really don't feel like I need to delve too deep into that one. That statement is obvious and frankly tells the whole story by itself. That's what I got for you guys though. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to leave a like and possibly subscribe to the channel. I'm gonna get back to work though. Thanks for watching, friends, and I will see you on the next one.